There is a small glass sitting on the counter in certain farmhouse kitchens in Lancaster County and Holmes County and the hill country of Indiana. It holds about an ounce of liquid, dark gold with a faint blush of red, flecked with tiny seeds swelling in the oil. The family takes it before the meal, before the bread is passed, before the plates are filled. They do not call it medicine. They do not call it a remedy. They call it a habit, something their grandfather did, something his grandmother did before him. A small act, so ordinary in those households that nobody thought to explain it or document it or give it a name. It was simply what you did before you ate. Most people, when they first hear about this, assume the interesting part is the ingredients. They want to know which one does the most work, which one lowers the pressure or clears the arteries or helps the blood move. And those are reasonable questions. But they are not the most interesting questions. The most interesting question is why communities that lived without modern medicine, without hospitals within easy reach, without pharmaceutical counters on every corner, why those communities produced generation after generation of people who worked into their 80s, who farmed hard ground into old age, who rarely seemed to slow down the way people slow down today. The shot on the counter is part of the answer, but only part, and understanding that part requires going further back than most people expect. Here is what is in the glass. A teaspoon or two of chia seeds, soaked in roughly an ounce of extra virgin olive oil, with a dash of cayenne pepper stirred through. The glass sits for 10 or 15 minutes before it is taken, long enough for the seeds to swell, long enough for the oil and the heat of the pepper to come together into something the old farmers would have called a tonic, a word that has nearly disappeared from the language. A tonic was not a cure, it was not a treatment, it was a daily practice intended to keep things working before they stopped working. The distinction matters more than it sounds. Let us start with what these three things actually are, because their histories are older and stranger than most people know. Olive oil was one of the most traded substances in the ancient Mediterranean world, not because people thought it was medicine, but because it was food, fuel, soap, and lamp oil all at once. The communities that consumed it daily, as ordinary food, not as a supplement, lived in ways that researchers centuries later would study and puzzle over. The Mediterranean diet, as it eventually came to be called, was not a diet anyone designed. It was simply how people ate in places where olive trees grew and pressed oil cost less than alternatives. The health patterns that followed were noticed long after the habits were established. What researchers eventually found, when they looked closely at extra virgin olive oil, was not a single compound but a constellation of them. Polyphenols, a class of plant chemicals that act as antioxidants in the body. Oleocanthal, which behaves in ways researchers have compared to a mild natural anti-inflammatory. Vitamin E. And oleic acid, the primary fat in the oil, which studies have consistently associated with reduced LDL cholesterol and better arterial function over time. The key phrase is over time. Not in one glass, not in 1 week, over years of daily use as food. Chia seeds carry a different kind of history. The Aztec and Maya peoples of Mesoamerica cultivated them for thousands of years. The word chia comes from a Nahuatl word meaning strength. Soldiers and runners were reported to carry them on long journeys. A small pouch of seeds for sustained energy on the road. When Spanish colonizers arrived and disrupted traditional agricultural systems across the region, chia largely disappeared from common use outside of its native communities. It was forgotten by the wider world for centuries. What those ancient communities understood practically, and what nutritional researchers have since confirmed, is that chia seeds are extraordinarily dense with nutrients relative to their size. They carry omega-3 fatty acids, the plant-based form called ALA, which the body can convert toward the longer-chain omega-3s associated with reduced inflammation. They carry soluble fiber, the kind that dissolves in water and forms a gel, which is why the seeds swell in the glass. That fiber feeds gut bacteria, slows the absorption of sugars into the bloodstream, and has been associated in research with lower total cholesterol and reduced blood pressure over time. The gel itself slows digestion, which affects blood sugar response to a meal, which in turn affects insulin, which affects inflammation, which affects the arteries. A chain of small effects that begins with a tablespoon of tiny seeds. The cayenne pepper is perhaps the most surprising of the three. It contains a compound called capsaicin, which is what creates the heat you feel when you eat it. Capsaicin has been studied fairly extensively. Researchers have found that it triggers the release of nitric oxide in blood vessels. Nitric oxide causes blood vessels to dilate, to widen and relax. When blood vessels relax, blood flows more freely. Pressure drops. The heart does less work to push blood through. Researchers have also studied capsaicin in relation to blood platelets, finding that it can reduce their tendency to stick together in the way that contributes to clots. These are not folk claims invented after the fact. They are documented in the peer-reviewed literature. What remains uncertain is whether the amount in a daily dash is enough to produce meaningful clinical effects in any particular person. The science of the mechanism is solid. The question of dose is still being worked out. So here is the preparation. You take a small glass, a shot glass, or a 2-ounce jar. You put in 1 to 2 teaspoons of chia seeds. You pour over them 1 tablespoon, maybe 2, of the best extra virgin olive oil you can find. The quality matters here more than most people realize. True extra virgin olive oil, cold-pressed and unrefined, still contains those polyphenols and antioxidants. Oils that are refined, blended, or stored badly lose them. The cheaper oil on the shelf is often not what it claims on the label. A good oil is slightly bitter, peppery at the back of the throat. Those are signs the polyphenols are still present. You add a pinch of cayenne if you want it. You stir, you wait 10 to 15 minutes. The seeds swell and the mixture thickens. Then you drink it before a meal. Before a meal matters. The soluble fiber in the swelled chia seeds, consumed before eating, begins interacting with digestion from the start. The effect on blood sugar and on how quickly carbohydrates enter the bloodstream is different when the fiber is already present than when it arrives with the food or after it. This is a small detail that old kitchen wisdom seemed to understand without having language for it. The shot comes first, then the meal. Now here is the part that changes how this practice looks. In traditional Amish communities, the daily eating habits surrounding something like this shot were entirely different from the habits of people who might try to add it to a modern diet. The oil was not consumed instead of processed seed oils. It was consumed in a dietary context built almost entirely around whole foods, fermented foods, seasonal vegetables, animal fats from well-raised animals, and very little that came from a factory. The fiber from the chia seeds supplemented a diet already high in fiber from vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. The capsaicin sat in a body that moved physically for hours every day, that ate modestly by modern standards, that slept when it was dark and woke when it was light. You cannot separate the shot from the life it came from. That is the problem with extracting folk remedies and importing them into modern conditions. The remedy was not an addition to an ordinary life, it was a small piece of an extraordinary one. This is the distinction that traditional health practices almost never explain clearly, because within the communities that practiced them, it never needed to be said. Everyone already lived the surrounding life, the daily walk across the farm in the morning, the physical labor that kept blood moving through the body continuously, not in a 30-minute session 3 days a week, but all day, every day, in ordinary tasks. The evening meal taken together without screens or distraction, the sleep that began at a reasonable hour in a dark and quiet house, chronic inflammation, which researchers now recognize as a central mechanism in cardiovascular disease, does not arrive in a single event. It builds slowly over years in a body underfed on certain nutrients, overfed on others, insufficiently exercised, insufficiently rested, and chronically stressed. The arteries do not harden overnight. The process is slow and quiet and ordinary, which means the practices that protect against it must also be slow and quiet and ordinary, daily, consistent, unremarkable. The Amish communities that maintained strong cardiovascular health into old age were not doing dramatic things. They were doing undramatic things every day for decades. The tonic on the counter was part of that. A small daily act in a life of small daily acts that accumulated over time into something the body could work with. Researchers who have studied Amish health outcomes have been struck by patterns that do not fit the expectations of modern medicine. Lower rates of cardiovascular disease relative to the surrounding population, despite a diet high in saturated fat from animal sources. Lower rates of obesity, despite caloric intakes that researchers found surprisingly high. The explanation that emerged was not complicated. Physical labor, thousands of calories burned in real daily work rather than sitting. A metabolic baseline built on movement rather than on restriction, and then bursts of exercise. That physical context matters when thinking about the daily shot. Olive oil consumed by a person who farms with horses and tools has a different metabolic role than the same oil consumed by a person who sits at a desk for 8 hours. Not because the chemistry of the oil changes, but because the body that receives it is in a different state. Its inflammation markers are different. Its insulin sensitivity is different. Its gut microbiome is different because it eats differently. The same ingredient lands differently in different bodies and different lives. This does not mean the shot is without value in a modern life. It means the value exists most clearly in context. What traditional communities practiced, and what has been largely forgotten, is that health was not an achievement. It was not something you reached or obtained or fixed. It was the ongoing result of daily habits so ordinary that they required no special effort. You ate this way because it was how food was. You moved this way because the work required it. You rested this way because there was no alternative. The whole system produced health as a byproduct of ordinary living. Modern life broke that system in pieces so gradually that the pieces were barely noticed leaving. First, the physical labor left, replaced by machinery and then by office work. Then the food supply changed, with processing removing much of what made food behave differently in the body. Then sleep shortened as artificial light extended the usable hours of the day. Then stress became chronic rather than episodic, background noise rather than occasional emergency. Each change was presented as improvement, easier, faster, more convenient, less effort required. The effort, it turned out, was not wasted. The effort was doing something. The friction of daily farm life was not an obstacle to health. It was producing health. When it left, something the body had relied on left with it. The shot on the counter cannot restore a farm. It cannot replace a life built around physical work and whole food and early sleep and community and the particular quiet that comes from living without constant electronic demand on your attention. It is a small thing. 3 ingredients in a small glass taken before a meal. But it represents something worth holding on to. It represents a daily practice of tending the body as part of ordinary life. Before the meal, without fanfare, as unremarkable as washing the hands or setting the table. It represents a tradition of reaching for small, consistent acts rather than dramatic interventions. A community that did not wait for the body to fail before attending to it. That orientation, daily prevention, Daily care, daily attention to small practices that support lung function is the thing that has most completely disappeared from how modern people think about health. We think about health when something goes wrong. We seek remedies when problems arrive. We treat symptoms when they become impossible to ignore. The traditional mind tended health as an ongoing practice, not as a crisis response. Whether you make this shot and take it daily is a personal decision. No one can promise what it will do for you specifically. Your body, your history, your existing habits, your overall diet, your stress, your sleep, your movement, all of it enters the equation in ways that no single ingredient can override or substitute for. But here is what seems worth carrying forward. The practice of doing something small and consistent before the first meal of the day as an act of care for the body. Not because one shot changes everything, but because the orientation it represents, the daily attention, the small, consistent act, the habit of tending rather than fixing, may be the most genuinely forgotten thing about how people used to stay healthy into old age. The glass is small, the ingredients are simple. The preparation takes 4 minutes. What it points toward is larger. An entire way of being in a body, in a day, in a life, that produced health so quietly and consistently that no one thought to document it, because no one needed to. We live in a time with more health information available than any previous era of human history, and are simultaneously watching cardiovascular disease remain a leading cause of death across the developed world. That gap between information and outcome is worth sitting with. The people who put this glass on the counter were not better informed than we are. They were differently organized. Their daily life did the work that information alone cannot do. Perhaps what has been forgotten is not any particular ingredient. Perhaps what has been forgotten is that health was never meant to be managed. It was meant to be lived, daily, in small, ordinary acts, in the structure of a day that built care into its rhythms rather than added it as a supplement to a life organized around everything else. Consider what researchers have found when they look at communities across the world that have maintained low rates of cardiovascular disease into old age. The traditional Okinawan population before the post-war Western dietary shift arrived. The Sardinian shepherds who walk miles daily and eat simply from land they know well. The rural Seventh-day Adventist communities in California, whose dietary patterns have been studied for decades. The Amish of Lancaster and Holmes County, who farm without engines and have been observed by researchers with increasing interest. None of these communities were following a protocol someone designed. None of them were supplementing a poor diet with targeted extracts. They were living in ways that produced particular physiological conditions, and their food practices were calibrated to those conditions over generations of ordinary observation. If someone got sick, the elders noticed what people had been eating, how they had been moving, what the season had brought. They adjusted. The adjustments became traditions. The traditions became habits. The habits became invisible because they worked. The anti-inflammatory properties of extra virgin olive oil polyphenols are documented in peer-reviewed literature. The cardiovascular associations with omega-3 fatty acids, including the plant-based form in chia seeds, are documented across multiple large studies. The blood pressure effects of capsaicin through nitric oxide release appear repeatedly in the research. The blood sugar moderating effect of soluble fiber consumed before a meal is well established. The traditional shot combines all of these in a preparation that takes minutes and costs almost nothing. What the science cannot yet fully answer is the dose question. How much of each compound, consumed in what form, over how long a period, produces measurable outcomes in an average person eating a modern diet? The research exists at the level of mechanisms and associations, not at the level of personal prescription. This is an honest limitation worth naming. And yet people in traditional communities were not waiting for the research. They were watching each other across decades. They were noticing who at 80 could still climb the hill to the barn, still do the work of the morning without stopping to rest. They were asking that person what they ate and how they lived and when they slept. They incorporated the answers into practice. The knowledge moved not through journals, but through households, through the habit of the grandmother, who showed the daughter, who showed the daughter, who eventually put the small glass on the counter before the meal without remembering where it started. That is how practical knowledge survives when it works. It becomes invisible because it becomes ordinary. Nobody documents the habits that everyone shares. You only write things down when they are in danger of being forgotten. The danger came when the life that carried those habits changed faster than anyone could track. The ingredients in this shot were never hidden. Olive oil has been pressed in the same basic way for thousands of years. Chia seeds have been available in health food stores in this country for decades. Cayenne pepper sits on nearly every kitchen spice rack. None of these required rediscovery. What required rediscovery was the combination, the timing, the preparation, and the understanding of what those things were meant to accompany. They were meant to accompany a particular kind of eating, a particular kind of moving, a particular kind of resting. They were one small piece in a larger pattern. The small glass itself takes less than 5 minutes to prepare. You measure, you stir, you wait while the seeds swell. You drink it before the food arrives. The taste is mild, slightly rich from the oil, with a warmth at the back of the throat from the pepper. It is not dramatic. It is not theatrical. It is the kind of thing you could do every morning for 40 years and think nothing of it. Which may be the whole point. The small glass on the counter does not shout. It sits there in the morning light, ordinary, unremarkable, asking nothing, doing whatever it does in the context of whatever life surrounds it. Perhaps that is the more unsettling question behind all of this. Not whether the ingredients work, though the evidence suggests they do something worth noticing, but how many other ordinary acts, small daily habits, so embedded in a particular way of living that no one thought to name them, how many of those have quietly slipped away while the products that replaced them grew louder and more expensive and less effective? The glass is on the counter. What else was on the counter that we have